The laughter reached her before the words did, sharp and careless, spilling across the street as she stepped down from the wagon and tried to pretend she hadn't heard it, because pretending had become a skill she practiced daily. Her limp announced itself with every step, the uneven rhythm impossible to hide on the open boards, and the town made room for it the way it always did, by turning it into something small and entertaining. Someone mimicked her walk from across the street, drawing another burst of laughter, and she kept her eyes on the ground, counting planks the way she counted days, because looking up only invited faces she had learned to endure. She told herself she only had to make it to the mercantile and back, that the distance had not changed just because the crowd had noticed her again, but the sound followed, words now joining the laughter, remarks about her leg, her pace, her usefulness, each one landing with the casual confidence of people who had never needed to measure their worth by how slowly they moved. A child laughed too, then stopped when his mother hushed him, not because it was wrong, but because it was impolite, and the difference mattered. She adjusted the shawl on her shoulders and shifted her weight, the familiar ache flaring up her side, and for a moment she considered turning back, retreating before the walk became harder than the humiliation, but retreat had never softened anything. It only confirmed what the town already believed. The sheriff stood near the hitching post, watching with a faint smile that pretended to be nothing, and that smile hurt more than the laughter because it carried permission. She stumbled then, not enough to fall, but enough to draw a fresh wave of sound, and someone clapped mockingly as if she were performing, and heat flooded her face as she steadied herself, forcing her legs to obey. She did not see the Apache at first, standing quietly near his horse at the edge of the street, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, because he was not watching her limp, he was watching the way the town leaned into it. He noticed who laughed first, who laughed loudest, who looked away, and when the laughter rose again, he stepped forward, not hurried, not angry, moving with the certainty of someone who had already decided what mattered. The woman heard the laughter falter just enough to feel the shift, and before she could understand why, a shadow fell across her path, solid and calm, and she lifted her eyes for the first time, finding the Apache standing beside her, close enough that the noise no longer reached her the same way, because something had placed itself between her and the sound. She tried to keep moving, because stopping only gave the moment time to harden, but the ache in her leg flared again and forced her to slow, and slowing had always been the part the town noticed most. Every step felt like a negotiation between pain and pride, and she felt the eyes track the compromise in her gait, the way people could read weakness as if it were a language they'd practiced since childhood. Someone muttered that she should stay home if she couldn't manage the street, and another answered that she needed to be seen to be remembered, and both comments landed the same because they assumed her existence required permission. The Apache walked at her side without matching her pace or correcting it, simply present, and that presence altered the air around them, thinning the laughter into something uneasy. She could feel the weight of his attention not on her leg but on the path ahead, as if the street itself were what needed watching, and that difference steadied her more than sympathy ever had. The sheriff cleared his throat and shifted his stance, eyes flicking between the crowd and the Apache, measuring whether this interruption belonged to him or to the town, and deciding to let it be neither. She reached the edge of the mercantile porch and paused, catching her breath, because the step-up had always been the worst part, the place where pain demanded a price. A man near the door smirked and offered to help in a way that was more invitation than assistance, and she shook her head, jaw tight, because accepting help on those terms cost more than it gave. The Apache did not offer his arm. He did not ask. He waited. Why, and in that waiting she felt the dignity of choice return, small but real. She set her foot carefully and lifted herself onto the porch, the pain blooming and then receding like a wave that had learned its limits, and when she straightened, the laughter did not return, because the moment had been taken from it. Inside, the shopkeeper avoided her eyes, embarrassed now by the crowd he had watched from behind his counter, and she gathered her supplies quickly, aware that the Apache remained outside, a steady point she did not have to look at to feel. When she stepped back down, the crowd had thinned, curiosity giving way to discomfort, and the street felt longer but quieter. She moved on, the limp unchanged, but something else altered, the sense that it had to explain her, because the walk she couldn't hide was no longer being used against her, and that shift, subtle as it was, felt like the beginning of something she had not dared to expect. He had been there before the laughter began, standing near his horse with one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, watching the street the way some men watched weather, not for entertainment, but for signs. And when the woman stepped down from the wagon, he noticed the way her shoulders set before her foot touched the ground, the small preparation that came before pain. He did not look at her leg first, because he did not need to. The town did that for him, leaning in with the practiced ease of people who had learned where to aim their eyes. What he watched instead was the shift in faces as the laughter caught, the way mouths opened and closed, the way a joke traveled faster when it did not risk anything, and he marked who joined it and who let it pass without resistance. He saw the sheriff's faint smile and understood it as a signal. Not approval exactly, but permission. And permission was often enough. When the woman stumbled, the Apache's grip tightened slightly on the saddle, not from anger, but from decision, because moments like that did not ask whether you would act, they only revealed when. He stepped forward as the sound rose again, placing himself not in front of her but beside her, careful not to turn her into a symbol or a shield, and the noise faltered as it always did when someone refused to play the role expected of him. He did not speak, because words would have invited debate, and debate would have given the crowd something to hide behind, and instead he matched the street's pace, slow and deliberate, until the laughter lost its footing. The woman did not look at him at first, and he did not demand her attention, because attention taken was different from attention given, and dignity required the latter. He watched her breathe, watched her adjust her weight, and in those small movements he saw resolve, not weakness, and that confirmed what he had already decided. When the mockery softened into muttering and the muttering into silence, he felt the shift ripple outward, a recalibration that made people uncomfortable because it required them to see themselves without the cover of noise. He remained still after she entered the mercantile, eyes on the street rather than the door, because the town was the thing that needed watching now, not the woman. A man cleared his throat as if to say something and thought better of it, and the Apache noted that too, because restraint learned in public had a way of lasting longer. When she returned, supplies in hand, the street made space without being told, and he waited for her to set her footing before moving again, keeping his pace measured because the moment was fragile, and rushing it would cheapen what had been earned. He did not intervene further, because watching had done its work, and in the quiet that followed, the Apache understood that silence, when chosen, could weigh more than words ever could. The sheriff's smile was thin enough to pretend it meant nothing, the kind worn when a man wanted to appear detached while letting the town know he approved of how things were unfolding. And the woman felt it brush her like a cold hand as she passed, because smiles from authority often carried sharper edges than scowls. He tipped his hat slightly, not to her, but to the space she occupied, acknowledging the interruption without naming it, and that half gesture told the crowd they were free to feel amused rather than corrected. A few men chuckled again, softer this time, testing whether the moment had truly passed, and the woman felt her stomach tighten because cruelty liked second chances. The Apache noticed the shift and stopped, turning just enough that his presence became unavoidable, and the sound died where it stood, as if someone had closed a door. The sheriff cleared his throat and said there was no law against laughter, that folks were entitled to their opinions, and the way he framed it made mockery sound like a right that needed defending. The woman steadied herself, refusing to shrink, because shrinking was what smiles like his were meant to provoke, and she focused on the rhythm of her breath, counting it the way she counted steps. The Apache did not argue the point. He looked at the sheriff and then at the woman, and the silence between those looks asked a question the law had not prepared to answer, about whether entitlement could excuse harm when harm was plain to see. A deputy shifted his weight and glanced away, uncomfortable now because laughter sanctioned by a badge felt different when someone stood beside its target without flinching. The sheriff's smile tightened, sensing the ground move beneath him, and he added that the street needed to clear, that loitering caused trouble, trying to turn the moment back into procedure. The Apache nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and guided his horse forward a step, positioning it so the woman had cover from the eyes that lingered, and the simple act changed the geometry of the street. People adjusted without realizing why, stepping aside to avoid the animal, and in doing so, they created space around her they had refused to grant before. The woman felt the change immediately, the pressure lifting enough for her shoulders to drop, and she realized that law smiled because it believed it would always be obeyed, but it hesitated when obedience no longer looked simple. The sheriff watched the space open and said nothing more, because to speak now would be to choose a side too clearly, and clarity was dangerous when the crowd's mood was uncertain. As the group began to break apart, the woman understood that the smile had failed, not because it had been challenged, but because it had been rendered unnecessary. And in that failure, she felt the quiet strength of having remained visible when law preferred her to disappear. The street settled into an uneasy calm, and the woman felt the familiar expectation return, the sense that attention would find her again unless someone redirected it, because in this town, hands were quicker to point than to help. A man near the hitching rail lifted his arm as if to gesture toward her leg, catching himself only when he noticed the Apache's gaze, and the half-finished motion hung awkwardly before dropping, because restraint learned in public did not like to be tested twice. The woman took a careful step forward, then another, the ache in her leg steady but manageable now that the air around her had thinned, and she focused on the sound of her boot on wood, grounding herself in what she could control. The Apache remained close without crowding her, his presence a quiet refusal to let the moment slide back into habit, and he watched the hands around them more than the faces, because hands told the truth people hid. A shopkeeper stepped out and opened his door wider than necessary, not as charity but as signal, and the woman nodded her thanks without stopping, understanding that help offered without spectacle mattered most. Someone else shifted to make room near the water barrel, then another near the post, and the path ahead of her widened in small increments, a series of choices no one announced but everyone noticed. The sheriff observed the adjustments with a narrowed gaze, recognizing that order had been reshaped without a command, and he said nothing, because silence now preserved more authority than argument. The woman reached the corner of the street and paused, weighing whether to turn back toward home or continue on, aware that both choices were being watched, and she chose to continue, not to prove anything, but because the day still belonged to her. As she moved, the Apache fell half a step behind, careful not to lead or follow too closely, respecting a boundary she had not needed to state, and in that measured distance she felt dignity return, not granted, but acknowledged. A child reached for his mother's sleeve and asked why no one was laughing anymore, and the question traveled farther than laughter ever had because it asked for an answer, and the mother hushed him without explanation, uncertain what to say. The woman heard it and smiled faintly, not at the silence, but at the fact that it had been earned, and she understood that hands which did not point could still choose to open, to step aside, to let a person pass without commentary. While as she crossed into the quieter end of town, the Apache slowed and stopped, letting her go on alone, because the moment had shifted from protection to permission, and that transition mattered. She walked on, her limp unchanged, but the space around it altered, and behind her, the street resumed its rhythm, subtly corrected, carrying forward the lesson that dignity could be restored not by grand gestures, but by hands that chose, finally, not to point. Silence followed her like a measured breath, not the empty kind that begged to be filled, but the deliberate kind that carried consequence, and the woman felt its weight settle across the street as she moved farther from the square. It pressed on the people who remained behind, forcing them to notice how loud they had been moments before, and how little any of it had mattered once the noise stopped. The Apache stood where he had paused, hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the town absorb the absence of mockery, because silence, when it arrived by choice, required more courage than laughter ever had. A man near the post shifted his stance and cleared his throat, then thought better of speaking, realizing that any comment would either reopen the wound or expose his own discomfort, and so he stayed quiet, learning in real time what restraint felt like. The sheriff lingered at the edge of the street, eyes narrowed, calculating whether order had been maintained or undermined, and finding that the answer depended on which version of authority he preferred to claim. He said nothing, because silence now protected him from choosing wrongly, and the woman understood that even power learned when to step back. She paused near the end of the block, leaning lightly against a railing to ease the ache in her leg, and in that pause, she felt the town's attention hesitate, unsure whether to follow or release her, and she waited until the hesitation tipped toward release. The Apache noticed and took one step farther away, increasing the distance deliberately, because protection that lingered too long could become another form of control. A wagon rattled past, its driver slowing briefly and then continuing on, eyes forward, and the ordinary sound felt like confirmation that life could resume without commentary. The woman straightened and continued, the silence traveling with her like a boundary no one dared cross, and she felt stronger for having carried it without needing to defend it. Behind her, conversations resumed in low tones, careful and subdued, as if the town were afraid of being overheard by its own conscience, and the Apache listened without turning, satisfied that the quiet was holding. He mounted his horse then, settling into the saddle with unhurried ease, and the simple movement signaled that the moment was passing. That intervention did not require permanence. The woman reached the bend where the street narrowed toward her home and stopped once more. Not from pain, but from choice, listening to the softened sounds behind her, and she realized that the weight of silence had done its work, pressing the cruelty out of the open and back into the places where it would have to be questioned. As she moved on, the Apache guided his horse away from the square, leaving the town to sit with what had not been said. And in that quiet reckoning, the woman carried forward something she had not been given before. The knowledge that dignity could be restored without explanation, held in place by silence heavy enough to be respected. By the time the woman reached the narrower stretch of road where the houses leaned closer together, the crowd behind her had thinned into individuals again. And that change mattered more than their absence, because crowds found courage in numbers, while individuals had to answer for themselves. A few people lingered at the edge of the square, uncertain what to do with hands that had been ready to point and mouths that had rehearsed jokes now left unsaid, and the awkwardness of it stripped away the confidence mockery had given them. Someone laughed once, a short, reflexive sound, then stopped immediately, glancing around as if startled by their own voice, because the moment no longer supported it. The sheriff watched the hesitation ripple outward, and understood that whatever order he believed he had preserved had shifted beyond his reach. And that realization made him step back rather than forward, choosing distance over enforcement. The Apache remained mounted near the hitching rail, reins loose, eyes on the people instead of the woman now, because the center of the moment had moved, and it was the crowd that needed watching as it learned to hold its tongue. A man who had laughed earlier rubbed the back of his neck and muttered something about having business elsewhere, drifting away without meeting anyone's eyes, and others followed in ones and twos, excuses forming quickly now that no one was listening. The street sound changed as well, the rhythm of boots and voices returning without edge, as if the town were trying to resume itself while pretending the interruption had been small. The woman did not look back, because the sound told her enough, and in that restraint, she felt the balance tip finally in her favor. The Apache nudged his horse forward, not to pursue or command, but to mark the end of the gathering, and the animal's movement drew the last of the onlookers aside, clearing the street without a word. A child stared openly, confusion plain on his face, and asked his father why everyone was quiet now, and the father answered only that sometimes people learned too late, and the sentence carried more weight than he intended. The sheriff turned away from the square and walked toward his office, posture stiff, leaving behind a space that no longer needed him, and the Apache watched him go with the same calm attention he had given the laughter earlier. When the last cluster broke apart and the square returned to its ordinary shape, the Apache guided his horse toward the road out of town because the crowd had lost its voice and there was nothing left to interrupt. Far ahead, the woman continued at her own pace, her limp steady and unchanged. The Apache allowed himself a final glance in her direction, not to check on her, but to acknowledge that the street now belonged to her as much as it did to anyone else. As he turned away, the town settled into its quieter self, and the silence that followed was not empty, but instructive, carrying forward the lesson that mockery only survived when it was echoed, and that once the echo was denied, the crowd had nothing left to say. She felt it before she understood it, a lightness that had nothing to do with her leg and everything to do with how the street now received her, because dignity returned quietly, without ceremony, when no one tried to take it anymore. The woman paused near the bend where the road dipped toward her home, resting a hand on the fence rail. And in that pause, She realized she was no longer bracing herself against eyes or words, only listening to her own breath and the steady ache she had learned to live with. Behind her, the square continued to dissolve into ordinary motion, the last murmurs thinning into the harmless sounds of a town resuming itself, and the absence of attention felt like space she could finally occupy. A neighbor approached from the opposite direction and slowed, offering a simple greeting that carried neither pity nor curiosity, and the woman returned it with a nod, surprised by how natural it felt to be met without measurement. The Apache watched from a distance as the exchange passed without incident, recognizing that dignity, once restored, needed no escort, and he kept his horse still to avoid turning the moment back toward himself. The sheriff's office door closed with a muted thud somewhere behind them, a punctuation mark on a scene that no longer required authority to define it, and the woman felt the final tension slip from her shoulders. She adjusted her grip on the parcel she carried and took another step, then another, each one deliberate but unburdened, and she understood that dignity did not erase pain or change her walk. It changed how that walk was received. The Apache shifted in the saddle and turned his horse slightly away, signaling his departure, and the woman noticed without looking, aware that protection was withdrawing because it had done its work. A breeze moved through the street, lifting dust without sting, and the ordinary details of the day returned with a clarity that felt earned. The woman reached her gate and paused, fingers resting on the latch, taking a moment to stand exactly where she was, visible and unremarkable in the best way. And she smiled faintly at the thought that nothing about her had changed except the space around her. Behind her, the town carried on, corrected by quiet rather than force, and the Apache guided his horse toward the road that led away, leaving no story behind him that could be exaggerated or claimed. As she stepped through her gate and closed it gently, the woman carried forward what had been given back to her without words, the simple, enduring knowledge that dignity could be restored not by explanation or apology, but by a moment of restraint that allowed a person to remain whole. No one came after her with explanations or regret, and that absence felt intentional, as if the town understood that apologies offered too late were another way of centering themselves, and the woman welcomed the quiet that spared her from having to respond. She moved through the rest of her day with a measured calm, tending to small tasks that anchored her in the ordinary, and each step reminded her that survival was often made of unremarkable choices carried through without comment. Word traveled, as it always did, but it traveled differently now, softened by the knowledge that the moment had not ended in spectacle, and when neighbors crossed her path, they greeted her plainly, not to make amends, but to continue, and continuing felt like respect. The sheriff did not send for her. And the lack of summons spoke louder than any formal acknowledgement could have, because it meant the law had decided to let the correction stand without reclaiming it. The Apache passed the edge of town as the sun dipped, his horse moving at an easy pace, and though a few eyes followed him, no one called out, understanding perhaps that calling attention back to him would undo what had been achieved. The woman felt no urge to thank him aloud, because gratitude shouted across distance often turned into performance, and she knew the exchange had been complete without witnesses. Later, as evening settled, a child left a small bundle of herbs at her gate and ran off before she could speak, and she smiled at the gesture, recognizing it as the kind of apology that asked for nothing in return. She brought the bundle inside and set it on the table, a quiet marker of change that did not demand response. Outside, the street settled into its nighttime rhythm, voices low, doors closing gently, and the woman listened without tension, aware that she was no longer the subject of the sound. She sat by the window and rested her leg, the familiar ache present but no longer sharpened by anticipation, and she reflected that dignity did not require validation once it was secured. It required only space to exist. The town had given her that space not through remorse, but through restraint, and restraint felt more reliable because it did not need to be maintained with words. As darkness deepened and the day closed without ceremony, the woman understood that no apology was needed, because harm had been interrupted before it could finish its work, and the truest repair was not spoken, but lived in the quiet decision to move forward without reopening what had been set right. Morning brought a steadier light, and with it a choice the woman had not allowed herself to consider before, because choices felt different when they were no longer framed by what others permitted. She stepped into the street early, the limp still there, honest and unhidden, and found the Apache waiting near the hitching rail as if he had never left, his horse calm, saddled, and ready. He did not greet her with words or ask what she wanted. He simply shifted the reins and turned the saddle toward her, offering the space without ceremony. And the simplicity of the gesture loosened something tight in her chest. She hesitated only long enough to measure the height, then placed her hands where he indicated, and he lifted her smoothly, carefully, without effort or display, settling her onto the saddle as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. The movement drew a few quiet glances from nearby doorways, but no laughter followed, only a subdued awareness that something had changed and would not be undone. She adjusted herself, finding balance, surprised by how natural it felt to be carried forward instead of left behind, and when she looked down, the Apache met her eyes briefly, checking not for gratitude, but readiness. She nodded, and that was enough. They moved through the street at an easy pace, the horse's gait steady and forgiving, and the woman felt the rhythm carry her without pain, without explanation, and she breathed deeper than she had in years. The town watched from a respectful distance, hands still, mouths closed, learning perhaps that dignity could be reinforced through action rather than commentary. At the edge of town, the Apache slowed and guided the horse to a stop, helping her down with the same quiet care he had shown lifting her. And when her boots touched the ground, she stood straighter, not because the limp was gone, but because the weight of being mocked no longer pressed on her. He nodded once, acknowledging the path ahead, and turned his horse toward the road that led away, leaving without claiming what had been done. The woman watched him go, then turned toward her own way, carrying the memory of movement and balance with her, knowing that the street would never fully forget what it had learned. She walked on at her own pace, unhurried, visible, and unafraid, because dignity once restored did not need guarding, only living. And as the town settled back into its day, the image of a woman riding forward without a word lingered, a quiet correction that would last far longer than laughter ever had. They laughed because it cost them nothing. He acted because silence had already cost her enough. No speech was given, no lesson was announced. One quiet act returned what the town had tried to take, and dignity was restored without asking permission. That is how redemption moves on the frontier, without noise, without witnesses, without applause. Sometimes justice does not argue. It lifts, steadies, and moves forward. And sometimes the strongest answer to cruelty is refusing to speak at all.